Well, hey, everybody, we want to welcome you back to the Build Strong podcast. The purpose of this time together is to build strong lives as we follow Jesus. And so whatever stage of life you're at, whatever season of life you're in, thanks so much for joining with us. I'm super excited that you're with us today because I have my friend Bo Noonan with us in the house as we talk a little bit today about your journey of planting a church here in Tacoma. How many years ago now?
We have been here 17 and a half years.
17 and a half years. So by every reality, it's no longer a church plant.
Right.
It's a fully developed, functioning,
Super healthy, wonderful,
transformative church. And we're going to get more into that story. But before we go there, Bo, you've been a gift in my life. You've been pastoring in the city for a lot of years. A little over 5 years ago, I became senior pastor, and you were one of the guys who came alongside of me in such a critical, important season. You were a voice of wisdom, encouragement. I often talk about our lunches. It was like all the B's and then the T, right? Because it was me, you, Bo, Brian. We had Bubba. All the B's kind of hanging out, just kind of encouraging, counseling Tyler to keep pressing forward.
That's a wild lunch group with a guy named Bo and Bubba in it.
But super fun. Before we get into the journey of New Community, the church that you guys planted, tell us a little bit about you, where you're from. Tell us a little bit about your family.
I was an Army kid, so we moved around, but we were never here. We were never at JBLM. But I had heard of this distant place called Tacoma through other friends of mine who'd been stationed here. And so grew up mostly, like by the time I got to junior high and high school, it was mostly on the East Coast.
Okay.
Ended up going to college in New Hampshire where I met my wife, who's from New Hampshire. And so totally different story. She grew up in the house that her grandparents built and her whole life. And I lived in like 26 houses before I got to college.
Wow. Yeah.
And so two different styles there. But while we were there, we found a church that we really loved, a church that was on mission in the community. They had purchased a home to tutor kids after school. And we just got caught up in the local church and saw the value of it. We had both been parachurch kids, which has its place for sure, and didn't really know what to think of the local church. And this church really just kind of showed us the beauty of Jesus's bride on mission together. And so got caught up in that. We got married. We went to England for a year where we studied and interned at a church over in England, and then came back to help plant a church in Boston.
Okay.
So we were helping with a church plant in Boston for 5 years. While we were there, we did a 3-year theology program, which included a lot of things on church planting. And at the end of that, people in our family of churches were saying, like, what do you want to do next? What do you feel like God's built for you? And we thought, well, we want to church plant again. We just saw the value of church planting, and they were kind of like, well, where would you want to go? And, Boston's a huge city. You could plant, dozens of churches and still just scratch the surface there.
Right.
So we'd considered other parts of Boston. We'd considered other parts of the East Coast. But one of the guys who was a real spiritual father to us said, have you ever considered the Northwest? And we were like, never. Like, we've never considered the Northwest. And he said, well, there's the stats had just come out. So this is like 2004, 2003, that the least churched states in America were Oregon and Washington. And we were excited about that. Like, we wanted to go where the unchurched were. And so through a series of things, just started to kind of explore the Northwest. And of course, you've got your big cities, Seattle and Spokane and Portland, and then this city called Tacoma that I'd heard about.
Yeah.
So, and that city just kept coming up, and there's some funny ways that it kept coming up. And I probably should have asked you before we started this, but one of the funny ways that it came up, because we started to think like, okay, maybe Tacoma, because we were a family with little kids, and at the time there were pastors up in Seattle saying there's more dogs here than kids, and we were thinking, well, we want to go somewhere where our kids can grow up. And anyways, so there was a lot of things that caught our attention, that God used to catch our attention. But one of them was, there was this article in the newspaper, kind of one of those silly articles that was Dateline, Tacoma, Washington. And so I was like, oh gosh. And it was about a bear that had invaded a camping site. And
in Tacoma.
Well, I think it probably wasn't, but I think that's the stamp they used.
Yeah.
But this bear got into their coolers. They had two types of beers at their camp. They had Bud Light and Rainier.
Yes.
And the Bud Light was all there at the end, and Rainier had been drank, and it was like this bear had a preference. So it was just silly things like that just kept our attention.
And that was the confirmation.
That was it. That was lightning.
We'll go,
that
Lord.
Was lightning.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so funny.
Several other things for sure, but yeah, there was a real desire to go somewhere where the people were not churched and saturated in religion, so through some exploration, we moved out here.
And so, your wife, whole life in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
You kind of all over, but mostly East Coast,
Yeah.
different Army bases, kind of moving around every so often, and the Northwest.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah.
Now, I got to ask a question. Okay, so growing up, kind of late 80s, early 90s kid. So people called you Bo back in the day.
Yep.
So I was thinking about this last night, like Bo Jackson.
Yep.
I remember this old commercial.
Yep.
Do you know what I'm going to say?
I do.
What am I going to say?
Bo knows.
Bo knows. Bo knows. How often?
That tormented my middle school days.
I was going to ask, like, did people walk up to you and go, Bo,
all the time.
you don't know diddly?
All the time.
Oh, man.
All the time.
But you've kind of worked through that.
survived it.
God
Yeah.
has given you
Lot
grace
of
to
therapy and healing. Yeah,
Good.
yeah,
Good.
yeah.
Yeah.
My oldest son's name is Jackson.
You're kidding.
Yeah.
Is there any
No.
sense of irony there for you?
It is ironic,
Yeah.
but it was not on purpose.
It wasn't on.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
But okay, so you guys have how many kids?
We have 3 boys.
Three boys.
So my oldest is a senior at Stadium. So when we moved out here to plant, he was 6 months old.
Wow.
And then we have a freshman named Judah and a 7th grader named Asher.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. And fun fact for people listening in, a couple years ago, we ended up at Mission Ridge.
Yeah.
Our families were all skiing at the same time.
Yeah.
And we have a couple of kids who are basically the same age and
Yeah.
the same grade. And so that was kind of.
And your kids were like
fun.
just shredding, and my kids were, pizza, French fries.
There you go. Well, that was definitely a fun moment. I love it. And so, you kind of clarified what led you to Tacoma. So you guys planted, you said 17 years ago?
Yep.
17 years ago. And what did that journey look like? Because it's not that a church here in Tacoma necessarily sent you out.
No.
I mean, you guys were pioneering.
Yeah, no one was waiting for us here.
Okay.
So we are part of a family of churches that really values church planting.
Yeah.
And so churches all over the globe planting churches together. And so when it was kind of settled, like, okay, hey, we're going to plant a church in Tacoma, the word goes out in our family of churches, like, hey,
Love it.
do you feel called? Do you feel stirred? And so some friends of ours, so our team was made up a couple from Kansas City, Missouri, St. Louis, Missouri, and Guadalajara, Mexico. So there were 8 adults and 4 little kids in tow. And we all knew each other, but had never done church together. So we never kind of had to, live in the same city and serve together. But there was an excitement around, like, hey, we're going to go together, get to plant with our friends. And there's a real thrill in that for sure.
Yeah.
And I think planting with a team is crucial.
Right.
There's actually a lot of study done on the success of a church plant is not primarily because of the lead planter, but because of the support, the 2s and 3s in that team that really can kind of implement things and commit to it as well. So and I would say that was so true for us.
Yeah. So it's not like this Lone Ranger, like, here we go.
Right.
I'm going to do this by myself. There was a framework there, but you just mentioned some places that are very different than Tacoma, because Tacoma's got a little bit of a feel, right? Like, our Bears prefer Rainier versus Bud Light, as you said. But Tacoma culturally, I mean, I'm guessing there was maybe a little bit of culture shock.
Yeah, I mean, so everybody had to come. I went. There was provision for me to go full time, but everybody else had to come and get a job. We had to figure out what Albertsons was. You had like, where's the best place to shop for this? one family had 3 kids at the time, and so they were establishing them into schools. And so the first year, I would say, was just a lot of like getting our bearings,
learning,
and meeting people, asking a ton of questions. I went to a lot of any kind of pastoral gathering I would hear of, I would go, primarily just to go through the front door of the church community.
Yeah.
And at that time, Discovery was planting in Tacoma. The Journey was planting in Tacoma. Soma had been here maybe 2 years before us. There was turnover at a lot of the big churches.
Yep.
And so it just felt like really exciting to be in Tacoma. And I think that's one thing that I love about church planting is it's a sign of God's grace on a city, and it's a sign of God's grace on God's people in that city.
Yeah.
That he's not left you alone.
Right.
You know, that
So good.
he cares about this city and wants to see people saved and added into his church.
Yeah. Yeah.
He wants to see justice. He wants to see families restored and prodigals coming home.
Yeah.
And so when church plants come into a city, I mean, I would encourage everybody to celebrate that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That there's a call. The call on someone's life is actually bigger than just their life.
Yes.
The whole church, like capital C church, can celebrate that.
Yeah.
And I felt that. I mean, I genuinely, I would say it wasn't necessarily true when we were in Boston. It was a little more territorial and tribal.
Okay.
It's a whole different vibe over there in terms of religion, with a lot of Catholicism and things like that. But I felt so welcomed here.
That's so good.
One church gave us 100 chairs. Now, of course, they were turning over their chairs, and so these had some grape juice stains on them and coffee. But we needed chairs.
Yeah.
And they were generous to that. One church gave us money. Just people were like, we're so thrilled that you're here.
Yeah.
And I have, for 17 years, have felt that sense of unity in the church.
Yeah.
Of course, there's bumps in the road, but overall, I think when you're in a city like ours and you look around and go, how are we going to do this? You think, I can't, we can't.
Yeah.
New community isn't going to solve this.
Right.
And so we lock arms together to see his kingdom come. And so it's been a beautiful thing to be a part of that. And my relationship with you, and so proud of you guys stepping into a difficult situation and persevering through that. But it just means the world, to have brothers and sisters, and not to feel like you're alone.
Yeah.
I've never felt alone.
I think that's so huge.
Yeah.
I wonder how much of that has to do with the uniqueness of, you mentioned when you guys were studying and kind of praying, researching, like where do you want us to go, God? Washington and Oregon, like some of the least churched areas. And I wonder if that builds in a little bit of like, it kind of breaks down that spirit of competition of understanding, no, we got to do this together. Right. I know I've talked to a number of church planners over the last couple of years, and when I hear they're coming to Tacoma, I'm like, we need more churches, not less.
Oh yeah.
Come on. Like we need everybody doing their part to see the kingdom.
Yeah. And again, it's God's grace.
Yeah.
To say, I'm hearing your prayers.
Yeah.
And I remember one guy in particular coming up to me when we moved here and saying, like, you're an answer to our prayers. And you think, like, I don't even know you.
Yeah.
But God's people have been praying for hundreds of years here, saying, God, do something in the city.
Yeah.
And when church planners arrive and churches are established, then that's the sign. He's answered prayers and not abandoning us.
And as you see that, so you guys 17 years ago, but I know you're still involved with your network of churches. You're still passionate about planting. Why do you think it's so important, even for people listening today? Because there's probably a spectrum of people, right? Some people who are connected to an established church. Some people they're connected to Life Center. Other people they're, somewhere in the journey. Why is church planting still critical and really at the epicenter of your heart?
Yeah, I think the main thing is it fulfills a mandate that's given to us in Scripture. So church planting isn't a ministry philosophy. It's the Great Commission.
Yeah, that's good.
And so when we go to make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them everything Jesus taught us, we're fulfilling the mandate.
Yeah.
And so whether you're an established church or a church plant, we all want to be involved in the Great Commission.
Yeah.
And so we all need to find our own ways to do that. But I would also say it is the primary way in which we see people saved.
Yeah.
The stats are overwhelming.
The stats are
with
overwhelming.
church planting. Not to say, you shouldn't go for it as established churches and have the mindset of a church plant, but the stats are there. It's part of the renewal of a city. There's a lot of activity around church plants where they're like, when we got here, we got involved in the public schools. We got involved with organizations that were serving the poor. And so there's just a kind of an uptick in serving and renewing the city. And I think, there's lots of things. I mean, the leadership pipeline is usually wide open in a church plant.
Right.
So leaders are developed in church plant probably at a more rapid rate than they are in a established church. Again, speaking in general terms, I know different churches are doing different things. I think the discipleship process is probably clearer in a church plant than they are often in. So there's just a lot of life that comes with church plants that, again, like, one way or the other, find a way to get involved in church planting.
Yeah.
Whether you're simply funding or sending people or training people, or, because it is primarily that mandate.
Yeah.
And the more post-Christian secular we find ourselves in the Northwest and other parts of the U.S., it really is kind of like reaching an unreached people group.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, I often meet people here who have no clue who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And so it's not like there's this sense of like, I tried Jesus and it didn't work. They're like, I don't know Jesus.
Yeah. What are you talking about?
Yeah. So, I mean, my uncle swears the name Jesus, but like, who is this person you speak of?
Yeah.
And so I think more and more, like even in the U.S. where people say like, oh, we have so many churches, why another one? Well, because
there's still people to be reached.
Still people to be reached.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I mean, I think another thing, you see a generation coming through that is, the stats on that, like biblically illiterate and, depressed and anxious and all these things, high suicide rates, just this horrible, horrible stats. Church plants tend to reach younger people. Mm-hmm. More so than established churches do. Yeah. Because again of the excitement around it and this kind of thrill of something new happening, and so again I think we should all celebrate that and get behind that. And when you think about our city, our public school system, our generation, Y, is it Y? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How do we reach them? Yeah. And so it's going to take all of us, like all of our youth groups and Youth for Christ and Young Life, and like we're all got to get in this thing together. Yeah. To see a generation come through. Yeah. So good. Yeah. So church planting solves a lot of problems. Right. Right. For all sure. That to say. For sure. Yeah.
And I think about the dynamic, the journey for those who actually say yes to that call, and it solves a lot of problems. But man, the faith, the tenacity, the grit to kind of stay with it. And I think that's one of the things that I love just about your story is you said yes, you moved your family, small child at that point, new territory, new space, you were welcomed into the city, but then you kept going and you had clearly some highlights, but probably also some challenges as you think about the journey of new community. Let us in a little bit. Like, what were some of those moments where you're just like, yes? Yeah. And what were some of those moments that in the midst of it, you're like, man, what did we get ourselves into? But then it turned out to be one of those moments of like, no, God, you're actually, you've proven yourself faithful. Yeah. Like you brought us through. Because I know church plants, they experience the highs and the lows, just like every established church. You face highs and lows, just like every individual in their own life. And I think getting the chance to peek in on that, maybe today somebody's listening and maybe they're not planting a church, but they're in one of those seasons of that feels like a low point. Well, the same God who's faithful to bring these church plants through is going to be faithful to bring them through. So.
Yeah. I mean, anytime we sing a worship song that sings about God's faithfulness, that's it for me. I'm undone. I'm like, we're gonna have to sing a couple more songs before I can get up and preach, because it's overwhelming, his faithfulness to finish what he started and to protect and to care for.
Yeah.
And I would say a few things, see if I can keep my brain organized here. One of our spiritual fathers, who was saying, like, you know, you guys could plant a church, you should go for it. He did say, hey, I got to be honest with you. Church planting is volunteering to get shot at.
Wow.
And it's warfare.
Yeah.
You know, you're taking ground and it's going to be met with opposition. So when we moved here, my wife had this mysterious digestional issue that no one could figure out. You know, no one could figure out what it was. And it was just really debilitating. And so, you know, it was kind of like, what's going on here? You know, we're immediately met with some things, and other people on the team moving, and jobs that were promised to them fell through, and housing that was promised them fell through, and everything had to be contended for. You know,
Right.
everything had to be prayed through and contended for. My wife was miraculously healed, actually.
Wow.
Of that, whatever that was, just through a couple guys praying for her, and that was it.
Praise
and
God.
so again, like breakthrough in church plants, you know,
Yeah.
miracles, but at the same time, you know, pushback.
Yeah.
So I think that's important to note. Like, I would never want to send somebody out in a church planting team and be like, it's going to be great.
Yeah.
You'll be fine.
This is going to be the time of your life. Yeah. Yeah.
You'll be great.
Yeah.
Any crack in your marriage, any crack in your parenting, you know, is probably going to be exposed. And so again, another great thing church planting does is it really stirs your prayer life.
Right.
And you battle and you contend for things. And so, so I think that's important to note. I think also the stories. One of my strengths and weaknesses, you know how like when you're a leader, you have strengths and that can also be your weakness. My strength is I'm like the toad in the boiling water, and I can stay for a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it never crossed my mind to pack it up. You know, like I people would say like, what was your worst time in church planting? And I hear a lot of people say, and rightfully so. I mean, I'm not judging, but
Yeah.
like, hey, I thought it was over. I never thought it was going to be, I mean, we'd be like a year into it, gathering 30 people, and I'm like, this is great.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so but it was also a weakness to be like, maybe something needs to change. You know, maybe you should consider doing some things differently. So kind of that short memory is a gift that I have. So I don't remember a whole lot of the early days because of that. But one of the things we did is when we started, we did Alpha. So Alpha is an introduction to Christianity, used by every denomination around the world, and amazing. So we just said, like, anybody who comes to any of our gatherings, which we started in a living room. We moved to that office space on 6th Ave above Taco Time.
Yes.
That's now a Hawaiian barbecue place.
Yes. Yeah.
That was like a glorified youth group room. I don't think they had DC Talk posters, but they might have. We then moved to an old yoga studio
Nice.
on St. Helens Street downtown.
Yeah.
Then we moved to the basement of Central Lutheran, and we did that on Sunday afternoons, which was horrible. Then we moved to Stadium, and we were at Stadium for 8 years.
Yeah.
And so each step along the way, there was a financial risk.
Yeah.
There was a faith risk. You know, there was like hey, do we have faith for this? And God met us every step of the way in that regard. And it kind of felt a little bit like we were always a step behind what God was like, no, come on.
Yeah.
We're like, okay.
Yeah.
And so anyways, we ran Alpha, and we saw people saved, which was so thrilling. You know, it was absolutely amazing. I remember the first baptism we did in someone's backyard. They had like an inflatable pool, and we baptized this woman, and it was just, you know, like, wow. And we saw God breaking out and doing miracles. And, you know, one of the things Alpha does is like, does God heal today? It's one of the sessions.
Yeah.
So we're like, well, here we go. And new family walks in, and his back gets healed like that in that session. And we're off and running. They're still in the church, you know. And
Amazing.
so, you know, the scripture said that signs and wonders will accompany the gospel.
Yeah.
And again, church planting is the gospel is going.
Yeah.
It doesn't say signs and wonders will accompany the parked car.
Right.
You know? So like as you go,
Yeah.
you'll
That's
see
good.
the power of God. And so that is another like encouragement to step out. And you ever feel bored? Like, I don't know if God's powerful. I don't know if God can do. Well, maybe we need to step out a little bit
That's good.
and move it forward, and he'll meet us there.
Yeah.
And so we saw lots of cool stuff like that. So we had spent that year in England.
Mm-hmm.
So we were at the YMCA. We used to take you're trying to meet people. It's so painful. And I'm not a extrovert. So I'm like walking into coffee shops I'm full time. So like, this is my job. Just wake up and meet people. And so I'm like, hey, the weather, right? And just like, I don't know. But we're at the YMCA and I've got my little kid there. He's probably like, 10 months at this point, barely walking. And I hear this British accent. And I'm like, I'm going to talk to her because I lived in England. And so I was like, oh, where in England are you from? She's like, well, I'm from Wales. I was like, right off the bat. Good thing it wasn't Australia, at least.
Yeah.
She said, oh, why were you in England? I said, oh, we were training to do some church planting and we're here to plant a church. She's like, oh, my husband and I are looking for a church to be a part of. Just things like that where you're like, what in the world, And anyways, there's just lots of little stories that accumulate into what is now, quote unquote, an established church.
Yeah.
Chance meetings and, the things that God is sovereignly ordaining, divine appointments that are just, unbelievable.
Yeah. How do you find yourself as where you're at now in your life cycle, right? As new community,
right?
How do you keep that edge in the church? Because I love what you're talking about. When you step out to plant, it's like, okay, there's really no safety net here. There's no just like status quo. Right. Either this happens or it doesn't. So God, you gotta. And over time, you see the miracles. You're reminded of the faithfulness of God. It keeps you moving forward through the obstacles. But I'd love to know, in your context. Yeah. Here we are, 17, almost 18 years down the road now. Yeah. How do you keep that edge, that heart, that spirit in the midst of what you're doing? Because that's something, I think about often is who we are as Life Center is. How do we make sure that just because we have buildings, just because we have this, that we don't kind of go, okay, cool, mission accomplished? Because that's not the mission. Right. The mission isn't just gathering people. The mission is continuing to expand the kingdom. And so how do we keep that heart in front of people?
Yeah, I mean, we would read the church planting books and the stats and be like, oh, that'll never happen to us. We'll never be the established church that, but man, it's so easy for it to happen. Yeah. When Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow because today has enough troubles, you're like, today does have enough troubles. Right. And those troubles can bog you down. Yeah. And you go into management. And I think the pandemic we're still recovering from that in the sense that you remember like, oh, we used to do that before because we kind of went into protective mode, We went into just trying to keep people around and alive and online. And so I think having to break back out of that again, one of the ways that we try to do that is through our community groups. So we try to get all of our community groups thinking about some sort of mission they can be on, serving the city, serving a school that their kid goes to, serving the rescue mission, or just trying to stay on some sort of mission. Yeah. And one of the things that's happened recently is we started to get people trickling in from Gig Harbor and Northeast Tacoma and Puyallup. And so we've established community groups out there that we celebrate big time. Like we're saying like, hey, we got community groups out there because we want those to turn into something more. Yeah. I don't know what they'll turn into. Yeah. But we're like, hey, we want to see this thing move, move out further and further. And, but yeah, you get a building with a mortgage, it's kind of like growing up and having kids and having a house mortgage. It's the same feeling of like, where's the adventure we used to have? Yeah. And it helps us because we're part of a family of churches that is planting. So we just sent a family down to a church plant in San Diego, which I was like, okay,
here I am, Lord, send me.
Yeah, exactly. On a bad day down there, you go pet a dolphin, you'll be all right. So we have a church plant in San Francisco, which I don't envy. That's a beast. Yeah. And we're involved in those kind of in meaningful ways, whether it's financially or people or bringing their people in. And so we're trying to keep that, that flag up in the church, like saying like, hey, we are planting churches. Yeah. Now, of course, we'd love to plant in Puyallup and Browns Point and Gig Harbor and all of that.
Yeah.
And we were praying and contending for that, but we also want to just celebrate what we can celebrate.
Yeah.
And it's hard. I mean, church planning is hard, and the success rate is not high.
Right.
And so we've often given a lot of money and sometimes people to something that didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And I hate that language if it didn't work, because
Yeah.
it did something.
Yeah.
God accomplished something in it.
Yeah.
But in terms of a church being established, that never happened.
Yeah.
But, and you can get a little weary with that as a church leader.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do I want to promote this one again? Do we want to raise the flag for this one? Do we want to cut the check for this one?
Yeah.
But again, you contend in faith and prayer, like, hey, this is the will of God.
Yeah.
We're settled on that. And I guess that's important to say. Like, if you're listening and you're not settled in that, like, you got to get into the New Testament and see that this Paul didn't just go make converts. He established churches.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Right.
he's saying, hey, Timothy, establish an eldership team. Titus, establish an eldership team.
Yeah.
Not just, hey, we celebrate that 100 people raised their hand.
Yeah.
It's like, no. Now we bring them into a discipleship community
Yeah.
that will transform the city that they live in.
That's right.
And so we believe that the local church is what we see in the New Testament, and we want to keep contending for that.
Mm.
And there's so many things that can distract you from it. It is the mundane Sunday to Sunday.
Yeah.
It is things that didn't work out. It's disappointment.
Right.
I mean, let's be honest, disappointment. You're like, I don't know if I want to do that again.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to stand in front of my church again and ask them for money.
Right.
Because I did that last time, and they're like, hey, whatever happened to that church plant? Like, yeah, it didn't quite pan out.
Yeah.
But we have to have a sense of we're established in that faith that this is what Jesus wants to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of that has to be connected to the reality, like, our job isn't always to determine outcomes. Our job is to be obedient. Right.
Totally.
And I think that's the tension that we all live with is everybody wants like a sure thing, like a guarantee. And yet what do we do?
Yeah.
How do we live in that as followers of Jesus, where we, especially in our American culture, like outcomes, like give me a business plan, give me this, give me
numbers
that.
And budgets.
And and all of those things have their place, but how do we continue to listen to the voice of the Spirit, the direction of the Spirit, and move when He says, here's what I want you to do, and were you obedient?
Yeah. And that old saying, like, what gets celebrated gets repeated. Mm-hmm. And so when you celebrate someone's obedience, people are going to be like, oh, that's what we're supposed to do. Yeah. That's the win.
Yeah.
The win wasn't that we sent you to this big city and you established 1,000-person church.
Right.
The win is you heard God's voice and you were obedient to it.
Yeah.
And we did our part. And we have a saying with even in our family, like, save the planter, lose the plant, So we never want to, that's priority one, is the planter themselves and their family and the team, is that we want to care for them. And if there needs to be a contingency plan, let's do it. There's no shame in that. Like you were obedient to what you felt God called you to do.
Beautiful.
And so it's not about a dot on a map. It's about people, and
that's good.
And it's tough. I mean, I don't tend to like to do things I'm not good at. Right. So if I keep failing at things, like skiing with the Sollie family, then whatever. then I don't want to keep doing that, because I want to feel successful. But so you have to change, what is success? What is the win?
That's good.
And there's times even in the scriptures, like Paul pushed on things, tried to go to this region, and the Holy Spirit was like, no. But he tried. Yeah. It wasn't like he was like, oh, I knew I shouldn't even try it. Yeah. Like, no, you try.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes the direction and the journey of the Spirit, it's not going from point A to point B. I had a season of my life where I was like, okay, point B, but it wasn't about point B. It was actually point C. Yeah. But I never would have said yes to C if I didn't say yes to B.
Yeah. And that would be our story.
It would be easy to feel like B was a failure. Did I mishear God, or what's going on? Yeah. But sometimes it's the journey that God has invited us into.
Totally. Yeah.
As you think about your context and just your heart as a pastor, for New Community, but even broader. So think kingdom. What are you learning right now about building strong followers of Jesus? Because you mentioned the journey of COVID and like all of the, whether you want to call it formation or deformation that kind of took place. But when you think about your heart, just as a leader in the kingdom, as a pastor, what are you learning about building strong followers of Jesus right now?
I mean, I think the pandemic, and I don't mean like the virus, I mean the whole thing that happened during the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was like a curtain being pulled back on a lot of people's hearts, in terms of where their hopes were.
Wow. Yeah.
And if I'm honest, it was slightly disturbing at times to see like, oh, I thought this guy was like a real, faithful follower of Jesus. But, and I think, Jesus was called a rabbi more often than not.
Yeah.
And he was a teacher, and you learned from your rabbi. You learned to be with them. You became like them, and you did what they did.
Yeah. Yeah.
You started to sound like them, and you wore the clothes they wore. Like that was the thing in those days. There was like an old blessing that said like, may the dust of your rabbi cover you, because you were that close to them.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a 1 hour class. It wasn't a seminar. It was life on life with these rabbis. And that's why Jesus gathered the 12 and they did that. They did everything together.
Yeah.
They're not just he didn't have a 1 hour class on Thursdays. They were at weddings together.
Yeah.
They were at funerals together.
Yeah.
And so I think trying to then think through what is the primary voice in the people in my church's life? Who's their teacher? Because there are a lot of teachers out there.
Yeah. Right.
I don't know if I even want to name some of them, but and I'm not talking about church leaders. I'm talking about news content and social media content.
And, there's a lot of noise for sure.
And so like starting to ask people, who's your primary teacher? And I remember saying one time I think I said it preaching, and it probably wasn't in my notes, and it was one of those moments that you kind of regret, but I said, I bet I can tell you who your teacher is within a 1 minute conversation with you.
Yeah.
And this is during the pandemic when everybody had an opinion about
everything.
Yeah. And we're like sweating now. Why are we talking about the pandemic? We made it through. And a guy comes up to me after, and he's like, "Oh yeah, who's my teacher?" Who's? I was like, "That's not my point. I'm not trying to."
What's funny is I could answer that right now. I was like, tone and question. But
since you asked, I think like, how do we get people to be saturated with the teachings of Jesus and the way of Jesus? So it's not just that, we love the end of the Gospels, that he died and he rose again, which is obviously primary.
Yeah, everything. Yeah.
But it's the whole of the Gospels that we should be grateful for.
Yeah, yeah.
We should be grateful that Jesus healed that blind man.
Yeah.
Because that teaches us something. We should be grateful that Jesus fed the 5,000, because it teaches us about his heart and what we should be like as his followers.
Yeah.
Conversations he had with the Pharisees, we should be grateful. Like those things should really stir us to thank Jesus. Like, thank you for that. Like, thank you that you didn't just come like an old Western movie, like come into town and they're like, who is this guy? Don't worry about it. Where are you from? Don't worry about it. Like, he was a baby in the midst of a community.
Yeah.
That he was called a Nazarene. Like, he was labeled by the town he was from, which wasn't a cool town.
Right.
And so I think like we should be grateful for all that, and trying to teach people, that. I love systematic theology, and I think there are like bullet point theological things that people should know and are helpful. But I think just getting caught up in the way of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, again, that stirs us to church plant, because Jesus often said, like, hey, we got to go.
Yeah.
And you're like, why? This is cool. Like, all these people are here and they love you. Like, you could be king right here. And he's like, no, there's others that need to be in my fold.
We need to go to the other villages.
Yeah, and I think like that's a church planting statement.
Yeah.
That, like, why should you got a building, you got a school, you got money, why?
Yeah.
Why should we?
Yeah.
Well, because there's others.
There's
where did you learn that? That's the heart of Jesus.
Yeah.
Like,
so good.
So we need to continue to teach, not just, not hang sermons on a verse, but like teach through the way of Jesus in that sense of there's more to it.
Yeah.
In terms of how you should think about every interaction you have in the grocery store, and like for us at the basketball game, when the ref makes a horrendous call.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just you wear the bracelets, it's what would Jesus do?
Yeah.
You know, if you didn't prepare like Jesus prepared, you're not going to do what Jesus did.
Yeah, that's good.
So I'm still going to yell at the ref because I didn't prepare like Jesus did.
Yeah.
So, and I do, but, and it was a bad call. But I think there is that sense of like, you know, this should inform every aspect of our life.
Yeah.
That's what this city needs, and that's what our nation needs, and all the nations need.
Yeah.
Is not more church gatherings with numbers, but we need people living out their faith.
Yeah.
And so these church gatherings should be places where we gather to celebrate and get equipped and trained and encouraged. But really, the emphasis of the church needs to be out there.
Yeah. Yeah. Not just going to church, but being the church.
That's the only way this city gets transformed.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good. One final question, you know, is it's so clear to me just from relationship, knowing you're so committed to building that sense of community that's on the mission of Jesus together. What would you, maybe just closing thought, encourage those who are listening today from that lens? Like, hey, just take it from Bo. Like, here's closing thought, closing word on be sure to be aware of this in community on mission together.
Yeah, I think we have to fight against our American culture that is about the individual expression. And I'm not just talking about that outside the church. I think that's a big problem in the church.
Right.
That I have my faith, and I really don't want you to influence it, you know, because it's mine and I've got it, and it's just Jesus and I, and we know what we're doing. You just don't see that in the scriptures. And so I would encourage people, like, where are you living this out together in community?
That's good.
Because one of the things I love about, like, I'm in a community group. My wife and I lead with a single woman in our church. We lead a community group. We have singles, we have marrieds, we have older people, younger people, all, you know, black, white, Hispanic, like all these different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds. And I learn about God because they image God in my group. Mm-hmm. So I can't actually know God if I'm doing this on my own, because I need to be around people who are imaging God, and people image God, and not that there's like unique ways, but then different emphasis when we're dialoguing around the scriptures in our community group, where I'm getting different angles of God because of people's different backgrounds and socioeconomic and race and whatever. So I think if you think like, and even in the church planting, like, do not try to plant a church on your own.
Right.
Don't do it. Like, you don't see that in the scriptures either. You know,
Right.
Paul is linking churches together, and so like, where is this community where you can be known and know people and learn more about God, but also, you know, lock arms to this bigger thing. Just like I can't be a Christian on my own, and New Community can't be a church on its own. Mm-hmm. We have to be meaningfully linked to other churches.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we technically are non-denominational.
Right.
But that's a bad term. I don't like that term, you know, because it indicates autonomous. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to be an autonomous church. You know, I don't want to be known for preaching unique sermons.
Right.
I want to preach the sermons we've been preaching for 2,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think we need each other in that sense to have accountability, but also to spur one another on, to know God, to know his ways. So yeah. I
love it, man. I love it. Thank you for taking time to share just a little bit more of your story, but also not just your story, your passion. Because I think regardless of where we might find ourselves in that journey, all of us can cultivate that heart to be on mission. Yeah. And maybe, you know, just the lethargy of life has crept in. Yep. And this is just that fresh spark for some who are listening today going, you know what? I do need to think about how I'm reaching. Yeah. I do need to think about how I'm actually embodying, not just going to church, but like actually living this thing out, not by myself, but in community. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe some listening today are like, you know what? I think God might be calling me to plant.
Yeah.
And that's awesome.
Yeah.
Like we need more churches
Yep.
in our nation. We need more churches in Tacoma.
Yep.
And so I know we're
Yeah.
cheering for that and believing
Yeah.
for that. Amen.
Amen.
Yeah.
Amen.
Yeah.
And local churches plant local churches.
Yeah, that's right.
So if you are interested in church planting, like if it's at Life Center, get a hold of Tyler and
Yeah.
let him know you want to plant a church.
Yeah.
And plant through Life
Yep.
Center.
Yep.
So
And I'll send you to Bo to get some information on how to do it. No.
I can't remember.
Yeah. Oh man. Well, again, thanks so much for taking time to be with us today, Joe or Bo. Joe,
right.
Bo.
Bro.
And if you have questions about anything you heard on today's podcast, you can be sure to send us an email at podcast@lifecenter.com. And as well, don't forget to take a moment to rate this podcast, leave a review on Apple Podcast or wherever you're listening today. Are you a social media guy?
Yeah.
Do you have, yeah.
I'm there.
What's your social media handles?
That's a great question. I'm on Instagram and Facebook as some sort of version of Bo Noonan.
There you go.
Can't be many of us out there.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it is just Bo Noonan. Is
There
it?
you go.
I'm getting a thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Yeah.
B-O too, not
Yeah.
fancy.
Yeah.
Not B-E-A-U, none of that. Just
None of
B-O.
that, just Bo.
Yeah.
Yeah. Bo. But make sure you follow Bo as well. I'm on there from time to time at Tyler Sollie. But thanks so much for listening to the Build Strong podcast. We'll see you next month, Bo. Thank you
It's a
for all you're
privilege.
doing in our city. Thank you for your partnership, your brotherhood, your friendship.
Yeah.
And we'll have to get back up on the slopes.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
Thank you.